This is the second part of the biology of learning and memory. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here. I know I'm going to end up chopping this is going to be chopped because the types of memory, we actually have lots of different kinds of memory, and they are relatively complicated because each type of memory is in itself, it houses a lot underneath it. But Donald Hebb, who was physiological psychologist, suggested that we need more than one mechanism to explain all of the phenomena of learning and memory. And so we just talked about classical conditioning and operant conditioning, but that kind of learning and that kind of memory is really different than sometimes what we think of as memory. So he said it was necessary to distinguish between short-term memory, so memory for events that have just occurred. If someone gives us a short string of letters or a short string of numbers that we have to remember for a little while, so someone gives me their phone number, I can keep that in short-term memory. That's really going to be different than long-term memory or memory for events that happened farther back in time. If someone gives me a string of numbers to remember, unless I really do some strong encoding of that or use that over and over again for that particular person, if I get that one time and remember it, I'm not going to have a long-term memory trace back for those numbers. That was something I was keeping in short-term memory. Whereas if we think back to some birthday that we remember from our past, I usually use my 5th grade birthday party. I went and had a skating party. It was probably one of my most exciting birthday parties, and I kind of remember parts of it. That is something that is not going to be in short-term memory all the time, right? I don't have that hanging around while I'm doing other things, or that would be a lot of clutter. That's back in my long-term memory. We've discovered a great deal about these memory systems since Hebb proposed them, and actually we've discovered more aspects and more, again, complications to those memory systems. This all started with research by Peterson and Peterson in 1959 and Brown 1958. It didn't all start, but the looking, really distinguishing short-term memory from long-term memory is clear in this Peterson and Brown. And usually what I do here, and I have left my slides because I love talking about memory, and I think it's a good thing for you to actually, if you can possibly do this, to think about the green questions and to perform some of these tasks on your own, maybe with a friend. So what I say here is we're going to distinguish short-term memory and long-term memory with a quick serial position task. And so what I do then is read out a list of words, and I'm going to go ahead and give just a few words here as an example, but I usually go and get some words from a random word generator, which I'll suggest if you're going to do this with a friend, you get about 15 words, and I'm just going to give you 5. I usually use something like dog, purple, canoe, elephant, desk. Okay, and I'll call those out relatively quickly, not that quickly, but maybe counting maybe 2 seconds between each one. That was just 5 words, and I'm not going to remember them all now, but dog, purple, canoe, elephant, desk are not hard for me to remember because I usually use dog, purple, and elephant. So all I really did was throw in a couple of different words. So, because I like elephants, love dogs. Dogs are in every single memory task that I play with my students. So if you're in another class with me, guess dog. Anyway, pick out 15 words, and what you'll see is that people are, and you'll see this most likely, it's hard to see with one person, but what you'll see is they do better at the very beginning. So pretend that was 15 words and not 5. They'll do better with dog and purple because those were the first 2 words. And then they'll do better at the very end. Sometimes maybe they'll just have desk. They might have elephant and desk. but sometimes they just have 1 or 2 words. Sometimes they have more like 4 or 5 words over at the end. And what we see there is, and then we see in the middle that people are forgetting a lot of the middle. It's hard to see with one person because sometimes there are people who remember some of those middle words, and when you add all the people together, this always works in every class. There is some little bump up with sometimes like a few people remember a word, but usually we have pretty low accuracy generally for those middle about 7 or 8 words if we're using 15, more like 10 or 12 words if we're using 20 words. But that middle has very little accuracy. The beginning, they're very good, and at the end, they're very good. Why are we saying we're distinguishing between long-term and short-term memory? The idea is, so if I'm just giving you 15 words and you can write them down or spit them back out as quickly as possible, people typically start by spitting out those last couple words because they're still in short-term memory. So you're kind of doing this rehearsing or thinking through the words, and those words are still in short-term memory, and you just jot those down. And then what you also have are words that got into a long-term memory. As you were first getting words, you were able to rehearse those words over and over again, but as more words kept coming in, you weren't able to do that rehearsal, so those first words were the most likely to get into long-term memory, and that's usually what we see, is people remember the first words, getting them from long-term memory, and the few last words, getting them from short-term memory. Do that with a couple friends. It's a fun little task. It always works. You can't see it with one person or 2 people, but once you get 10 people in there, that has worked in every single class I've ever taught. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a number of neurological double dissociations as we talk about memory, because we do see these double dissociations which show us. So basically in a double dissociation, we can see one patient with impairment to a particular structure or damage to a particular structure, and they have one function, I'm going to say function A, impaired, while function B is intact. And then we have another patient with damage to a different structure, and now function A is the one that's intact, and function B is the one that's impaired. And so this is very clear with short-term memory versus long-term memory, that these different structures of the brain are involved with those 2 different memory systems. And because we see this double dissociation, we know that those structures can behave independently. I don't need the one structure for the other structure to do its job, basically, and I don't need the other structure for the one structure to do its job. And so some people who've shown us this, if we look at Clive Waring or HM, and I'm going to talk about HM quite a bit, probably in the next slideshow, he had his hippocampy and actually some other areas around that of his medial temporal lobes removed in order to stop epileptic seizures. He was having multiple seizures a day, and sometimes a pretty major seizure, but often enough that they removed this part of his brain hoping to stop those epileptic seizures. But what happened was he could no longer lay down or consolidate explicit memories. So this was impairing his long-term memory, as he could no longer lay down new long-term memories. And we see the same thing with Clive Waring. So if you look him up on YouTube or anything, there's a pretty neat video of him talking and his wife talking. He also has, he had some encephalitis and was unable to lay down new memories. And he was actually, if I'm remembering correctly, the example that I gave at the very beginning of, oh, at last I'm conscious. Now I'm really conscious. And they look at their own writing and go, that wasn't me. I wasn't conscious before. And they get all frustrated that it looks like their writing. But obviously, I'm just now conscious. So that is really long-term memory. These people still have an intact short-term memory. And your author gives this great example. I'm not going to go through the whole example of giving him 3 numbers to remember and letting him for 15 minutes and then quizzing him on those 3 numbers for 15 minutes as he's keeping those in short-term memory and not distracting him, because that's key, But at 15 minutes later, he remembers the 3 numbers. He tells you this whole big strategy for remembering those 3 numbers, and then you distract him and get him to do something else, and all of that's gone. He no longer has the 3 numbers, and he no longer remembers the strategy that he just told you, as that was his short-term memory, though, was fine. But once we're distracted, right, we've lost what was in short-term memory. And we are distinguishing them from KF, who has damage to the frontal cortex. So the short-term memory is impaired and not long-term memory. It, of course, is more difficult to get information into long-term memory, but because usually we have to pay some attention to and do some kind of encoding to get information into long-term memory. And without short-term memory, that is difficult. But it happens if they are doing a particular kind of encoding. When information comes in, they can remember things, and especially if something has some emotional impact on them, they will remember it. So I'm going to give a story. I have a couple of stories of people I've met who have some kind of brain damage, and this was actually, I met the man's mother, and I was talking with her, and she was complaining about her son, about some of how he treated her and so forth. And so she was telling me that he had some emotional outbursts sometimes, and that he had a little bit more frustration in his life, and he would not remember things unless she did something really self-deprecating. So tell this story on herself of remember to use the oven mitts. The last time I didn't use the oven mitts, I burnt myself, and it was ow, 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 and she would do something kind of funny, but a little bit self-deprecating, and he would laugh at that, and he would remember that, but he wouldn't remember other things that she told him, and she felt like he was just not paying attention. But if he could laugh at her, he'd remember. And I said, well, I can tell you what she said he was in a car wreck, and I said, let me tell you what I think happened and what I think is happening with him. What I think happened was he wasn't wearing his seatbelt, right? And he hit the right part of his frontal area of the brain, so the frontal cortex. And she said, yes, that's exactly what happened. And I said, well, what happened there then is that is the area where you put language on your emotions, and so he's no longer able to tell you how he feels. And so what ends up happening, he also doesn't have some of the inhibitory connections. What's happening is his emotions are more frustrating to him, and he can't explain them as well. What's also happening is his short-term memory was impaired, and he can remember things, but he needs some kind of emotional tag that needs to go through the amygdala and the hippocampus, and it needs to be remembered and encoded in some way that's very memorable without him having to pay attention and to give some kind of this kind of working memory attentional. That part of his brain is damaged, and so it's not, you don't necessarily have to be self-deprecating to yourself. You can make fun of somebody else, or you can say something sad, something that will make sure that he remembers what you say. It needs to be emotionally tagged. And she was appreciative, and it really does help. It's one of those examples, like my brother with schizophrenia, where it really does help to understand how somebody else's brain is working differently, because we can give more empathy and compassion, but also understanding for how sometimes we might feel like we're being treated, where we have to say that's just how their brain works, and there's really no way to change that. But I can make things better for myself with my behavior. There are a number of reasons why we had to distinguish between short-term memory and long-term memory. Some of the real differences between them: short-term memory has a limited capacity, sometimes considered to be 7 plus or minus 2. If you know the Miller study, where the magical number 7 plus or minus 2, and the duration also has a capacity of about 20 seconds. I have a question mark after that, since usually to stop people from rehearsing there was some kind of interference. So question mark, 20 seconds. Long-term memory has unlimited capacity and unlimited duration. Really, we can talk to people in their 80s and 90s, and they can remember events from very early in their lives. It might not be very contextualized, but they have but they remember the events, even from childhood, some of those events. My mom still talks about running up and down the monkey steps, and she's 85. Okay. Long-term memory can be stimulated with a hint or a clue if we put someone into the same context, or if we give them a picture. And I think he gives the example of our grade school teachers, that if we give a picture of the teacher or start saying something that might remind you of the teacher, that you might come back to that teacher's name, even though it feels like it's gone, it's there somewhere. So, but if we're remembering something in short-term memory and we're keeping numbers or letters or whatever in short-term memory, and then someone distracts us and we go back and try to remember what was in short-term memory, it is pretty much gone. There's no, or at least we either remember it still because it got into long-term memory, or there's no hint or clue that can remind us of what we were just trying to remember in that short-term memory store. Memory has to be consolidated for it to enter long-term memory. So I have started using this word as I was talking about the hippocampus laying down explicit memories. That laying down is a really layman's term for memory being consolidated. I typically discuss the Atkinson and Shiffrin memory model, as I think we are going to talk about all of these different kinds of memory, and it's a good way to kind of look at the context and how this all fits together. We have all this environmental information coming into our sensory systems. We have now talked about sensation perception. We do have some sensory memory where we keep that information, a great deal of it, in its raw form for a very, very short amount of time. So on the order of 350 milliseconds, not even a second for visual information, and on the order of about 2 seconds for auditory information. And there is some loss there, and especially so there's loss there. We decide what to really pay attention to with our selective attention, and what we're going to pay attention to is going to get into our short-term memory. Anything that we did not pay attention to is lost. Short-term memory was originally talked about as this short-term kind of storage of information that we are rehearsing in order to keep that information within the short-term store. And so if you can imagine someone giving you their phone number without your phone to plug it in and just call them right away and get it, as we do now, but you actually have to remember this phone number for a little while. You might say it to yourself and rehearse it to yourself, or come up with some kind of encoding to remember that. Again, there is loss at this point. For information that we do get into long-term memory, we talk about that as encoding, that process of encoding information into long-term memory. Another thing we're doing with short-term memory is we are taking information out of long-term memory in order to handle it in the here and now. So there's a process of retrieval from long-term memory. And we go to long-term memory, and there's still loss. We have this unlimited capacity, but we do lose information. And as I've already alluded to without stating really clearly, a lot of times what we're losing from the events in our lives is the context. But we're gonna lose information. We can't just keep all of the information that we get into long-term memory in there.